immigration for the RN. So there are basically three different scenarios or three different ways that a nurse can come and live and work in the US. The first is called the TN, the second is a green card, and the third is an H-1B visa. A little bit more about each of those. The TN status or the TN visa is a non-immigrant status. So important to differentiate that from the green card, which you'll see is an immigration process. TN is non-immigrant status in the US for Canada and Mexico, and it offers expedited work authorization to citizens of these countries. So how the TN works is that if the nurse, for instance, is a citizen of Canada, they meet the licensing requirements, so they have passed the NCLEX, they have a visa screen certificate, and they have a job offer, they can come and work in the US on a TN. The TN is for 3 years, and they can renew that TN indefinitely as well. The green card or permanent resident refers to the immigrant process of becoming a lawful permanent resident. And there are two different types of green cards. So the one is a consular green card. That is if the nurse is outside the country. So for instance, if I was speaking about the surgery center we're working with in New York, we have a number of nurses that we have that they have hired, and these nurses we have one that is in the Philippines, one that is in the Middle East, also a Filipino nurse, one is in the UK. So those nurses would be coming through on what's called a consulate green card, and they go through the consulate or the embassy in the country where they are based. But there is a different kind of green card as well, and that is called the adjustment of status green card. And that is if the RN is inside the US for some reason. So it might be that they are here, they could be on a TN, they came on a TN, they really like it, they want to put down roots and stay in the US for a longer period of time, and now they can do an adjustment of status because they're inside the US, they can do an adjustment of status green card, or they are maybe a student. So it might be, they are here as a nursing student, and they are, they're finishing their studies, and they are then going to be wanting to get a sponsor, which is then would come under this heading of adjustment of status green card. The last category is an H-1 visa, which is an employment-based non-immigrant visa for temporary workers, and this can be granted if the position is considered a specialty occupation. So the H-1 visa is really more typically only used for specific occupations, like a nurse manager or a nurse practitioner. It really isn't applicable for a regular staff nurse. So from a Connetics perspective, for instance, pretty much most of the nurses that we work with will come through either on a green card or on a TN. And just a note also to mention is that only registered nurses will qualify for immigrant purposes. If the nurse is an LVN, or in South Africa we have enrolled nurses, in Canada we have LPNs, unfortunately they will not qualify for immigration purposes to come to the US. Only RNs will qualify. A little bit more about the TN under the immigration category. So registered nurses are one of the occupations that qualify for the TN under the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA agreement. As I said, this visa is available for Canadian and Mexican citizens for certain occupations only. So there is a list of occupations that you can Google, and we actually have that as well available for you. A list of occupations that qualify for the TN, and RNs obviously are one of them. Just to speak a little bit about the Mexican citizens, the process for a Mexican citizen is a little different than for a Canadian coming to the US. Canadians can go through any port of entry, any airport, or drive through any of the borders. The Mexican citizens have to go to a consulate to obtain the visa. So it is a little bit of a different process. But I would say, I've been doing this for many, many years, and we have brought a few Mexican nurses into the US, but I would say pretty much on the TN side, it's been Canadian. The reason for that has obviously been a lot of times is the language barrier. It's more difficult for Mexican nurses to pass the English exam, and obviously most of them were not trained, well, all of them were not trained in English, and that's the reason why we tend to see more nurses coming from Canada on this particular visa. So it is a temporary working visa. It allows the nurse to work in the US for 3 years, and as I mentioned, it is renewable. It's a pretty simple process. So once the nurse has all of the requirements, they basically will go to an airport or can drive through a border post with a list of documents we have. There's a specific format. So there's a specific TN letter, like a template that we have that the nurses, that the facility needs to send for the nurse to show that they have a job offer in the US. And then as long as they have all the different requirements for TN, they can get that TN stamped into their Canadian passport and come and live and work here. It's a very simple process. It costs $50, and it's pretty quick. So it's the easiest of the visas to work with. There is also a TD visa, and this is a dependent visa which allows the spouse and the children of a Canadian or a Mexican professional to join the TN employee in the United States as a dependent. It is important to mention that only children under 21 will qualify on the TD visa, and that the spouse can definitely come with the nurse, but the spouse cannot work unless they have an occupation that is also on the list of occupations that qualify for TN. So that's just an important distinction, because that's also obviously very important for us to make sure that we communicate with the nurses, with the facility, because the last thing anyone wants is for a nurse to arrive in the US, the spouse to come with, the spouse to expect that they'll be able to work, and then they realize they are on a single income and the spouse can't work, and all kinds of problems evolve from there. So very important for everybody to understand how these visas work and what the implications thereof. Also just wanted to mention, in October 2018, the newly renegotiated NAFTA deal became known as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA. So the name for that visa has changed. Moving on to the next slide. So just to sum up some of the things we've been speaking about the TN in terms of the requirements and the process. So the requirements for the TN are that the nurse must be a registered nurse. No LVNs, LPNs, RPNs, as they call them in Canada, will qualify. Must be a Canadian or Mexican citizen. And important is to distinguish that the TN is based on citizenship, not on country of birth, whereas the green card is based on country of birth, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But the TN is based on citizenship, and the nurse must have a job offer from a U.S. employer, and it is formatted in a certain way on the TN letter. We have that format, and we can help the nurses and help the employers with that. The nurse must have passed the NCLEX and must have a visa screen certificate from the CGFNS. To recap, the process is that once the requirements are completed, the Canadian nurse, and we say Canadian nurse just because most of the nurses that come through on the TN are Canadian, but of course, this applies to Mexicans as well. But the Canadian nurse can apply for the TN at a port of entry, and the Mexican nurse must do so at the consulate. Upon entry to the United States, the nurse can then apply for Social Security, and in most cases, the RN will need to have the Social Security number in order to endorse their RN license. So, as I mentioned before, not all states, you can't apply to write the NCLEX or do an endorsement without a Social Security number at many of the states. So we need to navigate that on a per state basis. The TN, as I mentioned, is a simple process. It's pretty fast as long as the nurse has completed the requirements from a licensure perspective. So, still under the immigration umbrella, going to talk a little bit more about the consulate green card. The consulate green card, the requirements of an employment-based green card sponsorship if the nurse is outside the country. And here I just want to mention that this is employment-based. So there are different kinds of green cards. The one that we're speaking about here is an employment-based green card, and specifically we call it the EB3. The nurse must be a registered nurse, again, the same as for a TN, must have an employer or a sponsor in the United States. The position must be a full-time permanent position. The employer must pay a wage equivalent to the prevailing wage set by the Department of Labor for the area and the position offered. And in fact, the first step of the green card process is where we apply to the USCIS, which is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, for the prevailing wage determination. The nurses are required to pass the NCLEX and obtain a visa screen, so same as for the TN. There is an additional requirement that is optional, but many immigration lawyers are suggesting that nurses comply with this next step as well, is that they also obtain an educational equivalency report. There was a new memo that came out on September 11th of this year from the USCIS that they will no longer, in adjudicating green card petitions, that they will no longer give out what's called a request for further evidence or a NOID, notice of intent to deny, when they are adjudicating cases. And basically what that means is that previously, in months and in years before, when you submitted a case to the USCIS for a petition, if there was some document or some additional information that they wanted, they would send out what was called an RFE, request for further evidence. With a new change for September 11th, that kicked in on September 11th, the USCIS no longer has to do that. So there really is more, the officers adjudicating the cases have more discretion in terms of the adjudication. So what a lot of immigration lawyers are suggesting at this time is that we give additional documentation. So that's why we wanted to include that about the educational equivalency report. That is not something that's required, but a lot of people are including that in petition cases as additional information, so that we are hopeful that the cases will get approved. The consular green card process goes through a number of stages. So the first is called the prevailing wage. After that, and that takes about 3 to 4 months to come back from the Department of Labor. Once that is approved, then the case goes to posting. The job is posted by the facility for 10 business days. And after that, there is a 30-day rest period. Once the 30-day rest period is completed, then the cases are filed with the I-140 petition. So that's something that people will hear a lot if you are filing green cards, the I-140 petition, and that is where the facility will send in documentation, the nurse will send in documentation, and that will be filed with the USCIS. There is an option when you file a case to do premium processing. There's an extra cost for that. But if you decide to do it, the cases will be either approved or denied within 15 working days. Once they are approved, hopefully, the case moves to the National Visa Center, that's the NVC. Additional documentation is supplied at that point, and then the case will go to the consulate interview. And at the consulate interview stage, the nurse, the whole kind of petition will be approved, and the nurse needs to come into the U.S. within 6 months. Just as an aside as well, I wanted to mention that Connetics have actually put together a video of the number of the different stages of the green card petition. We have one on the Consular green card. We have one on the TN, and we are actually in the process of putting one together for the next slide, for the next stage, which is the next slide, the adjustment of status green card. So if anybody would like to get a copy of those videos, it's just kind of like an animated video, which I think simplifies the process and just gives you kind of a roadmap of the different stages, because it can also be a little bit confusing in terms of the different stages of the green card. So we'd be happy to share that with you if you like. So moving on, again, under the immigration umbrella, we're going to talk now about the adjustment of status green cards. This is, of course, if the nurses are inside the country. So adjustment of status is the process that a nurse can use to apply for lawful permanent resident status when present in the United States. So for instance, it might be that the nurse is here as a student. Maybe they are here on a TN. Maybe they came a few years ago on a TN and they have now decided they want to stay and put down roots. So there might be various different scenarios of why a nurse might be in the US and why they might want to begin an adjustment of status green card. Obviously, the individual must have lawfully entered the United States and meet certain requirements. And this means that the RA may get the green card without having returned to their home country. So the adjustment of status green card also goes through a number of stages. It is similar to the stages that are gone through, that the nurse goes through with the consulate. And there was a change recently actually with adjustment of status green cards. In years before, the nurses didn't have to go through an interview, but that is one of the changes that we're seeing right now, that adjustment of status green cards need to go through an interview as well here in the US. So that pretty much sums up the immigration piece and the licensing and credentialing pieces of the puzzle for international recruitment.